If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? We've all heard of this age-old question before, but what does it actually mean? In physics, sound can be thought of as the vibration of molecules propagating through a medium, something which is generally attributed to a sudden disturbance in air pressure. When a tree falls to the ground, it violently forces the air molecules between itself and the ground outwards. This leads to a higher concentration of molecules surrounding the tree, a higher air pressure, which then spreads out and diffuses in the form of a sound wave. But it can't be a sound without somebody hearing it, right? As the sound wave propagates, it reaches our ears and makes our eardrums vibrate. This vibration is then converted by the cochlea into electrical signals which are then sent to the brain, and the brain in turn interprets these signals as sounds. And thus we get to hear the sound of the tree falling in our conscious experience of the world. So ultimately the question is this: without our conscious experience of it, can we even say that the sound exists? And what if we were to imagine a world without ears? Can we even say of this world that it is a place in which sound exists? Dare we take this a little further and ask, in a world without conscious beings, does the world itself even exist? The answer to these questions and more coming right up. Hi, my name is Thibaut and I make videos on philosophy and science. Today's episode is going to be on phenomenology, idealism, and we're even going to be touching a little bit on ontology. Now, I've decided to split this essay into two parts, firstly because a single video would have just been far too long, but also because I felt like otherwise the script was just going to end up all over the place. So, in this first video we're going to be sticking to the ideas of phenomenology and idealism, and in part 2 we'll be getting a little more metaphysical and start asking questions about the fundamental nature of reality itself. And with that out the way, let's dive in. Say that somebody is walking out in the woods when they come across a fallen tree. This person did not hear the tree fall, but as they continue wandering around, they notice that a microphone has been left nearby recording. As they recover the audio from this recording and play it back, they distinctly hear the sound of the tree falling. Now, it can be argued whether the sound from the recording is the same sound that the tree made when it fell, but we're not going to get into that right now. So, did the tree with no one around to hear it make a sound as it fell? Well, yes, otherwise the microphone wouldn't have picked up on anything. When the tree fell, it caused the molecules of air around it to compress. These sound waves then travelled to the microphone where they hit against its membrane, converting the kinetic energy of the molecules into electrical signals which were then recorded by the device. Okay, but then what if there wasn't just a microphone conveniently lying around? Would the tree have still made a sound? Now would probably be a good time to start introducing a little bit of terminology. So let's start making a distinction here between, on the one hand, the sound that the tree has made, and on the other, the sound that the person has heard. The sound that the tree made, that physical vibration of molecules, is what we shall refer to as the noumenal sound. The noumenal is what we posit to exist out there, independently of our subjective experience. On the other hand, the sound that our woodland rambler had heard is what we shall refer to as the phenomenal sound, or qualia of sound. Now, by phenomenal, we don't mean that the sound that the tree made was amazing. We just mean it in the original Greek sense of the term, phenomenon, meaning that which appears, as in the sound that appeared to our subject's conscious experience as they were listening to the recording. So, to answer our previous question, yes, the tree with no one around to hear it did make a sound. It just wasn't quite the phenomenal kind that anybody might have perceived. So, is this the ultimate answer to the question of the tree that falls? That yes, the tree made a noumenal sound, but just not quite the phenomenal one that we were expecting? Well, no. This answer just isn't going to cut it. It's just not that satisfying. First of all, just because there wasn't somebody there to hear it or a microphone conveniently lying around, doesn't mean that there can't still be a phenomenal sound. To sort of defend this point, I just want to mention very briefly an experiment that was led by a team of researchers at MIT back in 2014. This experiment is known as the visual microphone, and I'll leave links for it in the description for those who are curious. Basically, the experiment goes like this. 1. A pack of crisps is placed on the ground inside a room. 2. A high-speed camera is placed outside the room, looking in at the bag of crisps through a soundproofed window. 3. A recording of the nursery rhyme, "Mary Had a Little Lamb," is then played inside the room next to the bag of crisps. So the idea here is that the camera, which is placed behind a soundproofed window, cannot hear the sounds that are being played inside the room. I mean, it also happens to be a camera, not a microphone, so it's recording video anyways, not audio, but I digress. Because the camera is filming the bag of crisps, it is able to pick up on those tiny little vibrations that the sound waves are causing on the bag of crisps. From these vibrations, which in the footage are ultimately just slight variations in pixel luminance, the team was then able to recover a pretty recognizable audio clip of the original recording that was being played inside the room. Essentially, just by filming through a soundproofed window, the team at MIT was able to recover the sounds that would have otherwise been trapped inside that room. By the way, this is giving me mad CIA vibes. To tie this back to the fallen tree, what we're saying is that, just like the vibrations on the bag of crisps, the action of the tree falling has left some imprint on the physical world. And this imprint might allow us to recover the sound that the tree made as it fell. For example, as the tree fell, it would have swept up some of the dirt from the ground beneath it and rustled up some of the leaves of the nearby trees. Although these signs might not be as readily interpretable as a neat audio recording, they are still a direct consequence of that same air being rushed out from beneath the tree. If we were some super intelligent investigative species, then we might just be able to take a look at some of these clues and figure out what the tree must have sounded like as it fell. We're not saying that we will necessarily be able to recover this sound. We're just assuming that it can in theory be done. Basically, we're just steel-manning the argument that the tree has in fact made a perceivable sound. What we're saying is that so long as the tree has had some effect on the physical world, so long as the tree has made a noumenal sound, then we are assuming that the phenomenal sound can also be perceived. Ultimately, we are simplifying the question of the tree that falls by removing the need to distinguish between the noumenal and phenomenal. Let's just take this idea out to its absolute limits real quick, just to make sure we're on the same page. Say we were to go back in time some 1.4 billion years ago, an era known as the Mesoproterozoic, a period when life was just about figuring out sexual reproduction, marking the true beginnings of complex multicellular life on Earth. Back in those days, life was pretty simple. Ears hadn't evolved yet, and so there was actually no one around that could hear sound. Mind you, there were no trees to be heard yet either. Those would take another billion years or so to come around. One sound that would have been around, though, would have been the constant roaring of volcanoes. Indeed, the Proterozoic was a notoriously active eon tectonically, and there would have been quite a few rumbling volcanoes back in those days. So, is it fair to say that the volcanoes of the Proterozoic didn't make a sound, since there was no one around yet to hear them? Well, no, since the sounds of the Proterozoic still do not exist in isolation. Let's imagine there is a highly advanced alien civilization that is pointing their telescopes directly at us. This civilization lives precisely 1.4 billion light years away, meaning the light that they are receiving from Earth was light that was emitted around the time of the Proterozoic. Well, if this civilization were to use the old visual microphone technique we mentioned earlier, then they should in theory be able to recover the sounds that our volcanoes made some 1.4 billion years ago. Now, obviously this seems like a pretty far-fetched idea, even for a highly advanced alien civilization such as that of our extraterrestrial neighbours, but we're not really concerned about the practical feasibility of such an exploit. Again, we're just steel-manning the argument. We're being as lenient as we possibly can. For the purposes of this video, we are assuming that so long as there exists some relation between the sound that the tree made and an observer with the ability to hear it, no matter how great, no matter how improbable it might be for them to recover it, then we are presuming that the sound exists. Even though the sounds of the Mesoproterozoic existed 1.4 billion years before our time, and 1.4 billion light years away from our alien neighbours, since information can travel between those sounds and the observer, there still exists some relationship between the noumenal sound and a being with the ability to perceive it. And so we are presuming that the sound exists. But that's not all. Actually, the question of the tree that falls is hinting at something a little deeper than this. Really, what it is nudging at is, can the noumenal even exist without the phenomenal? In the introduction to this video, we offered to define sound as the vibration of molecules propagating through a medium. According to this definition, if one were to pluck a guitar string out in the vacuum of space, which if you didn't know already is a notoriously quiet gig, then even though we would be unable to hear it, this vibration would still be considered a sound. In a way, this reductionist approach of defining sound is an attempt to describe it independently of our subjective experience. It makes it seem as though sound is something that exists out there, whether we perceive it or not. However, the only reason that we are calling it a sound is because it is in theory hearable. If one were to use the visual microphone on that guitar, for example, then we could actually quite easily recover the sound that was being made by plucking the string. But perhaps more importantly, were we not beings with the ability to hear sound, then we would have never come up with this physical definition of sound in the first place. It would seem as though the aim of science is to describe the world as objectively as possible. However, we have to keep in mind that, no matter how we go about it, whatever scientific description of sound we come up with, that description first will have had to have stemmed from somebody's subjective experience. This is the main idea behind Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of perception. Without us, sound has no meaning. As a concept, it would have remained undefined. Basically, without vibrating molecules, there is no sound. Without ears, a cochlea, and a brain to interpret those signals, there is no subjective experience of sound. But without that subjective experience, there is no definition of sound as vibrating molecules. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Sound cannot exist independently of subjective experience, because subjective experience is the only reason we have a noumenal definition of sound. None of these things exist independently from one another. Nothing really exists in isolation. Sound does not exist independently of subjective experience. Instead, it exists precisely as this relationship between subjective experience and physical reality. And actually, this is the underlying thesis behind today's essay, that all things that exist in relation to one another. The thought experiment of the tree that falls says that there is nobody around to hear the sound, but it implies that had there been, somebody would have heard it. Because we're steel-manning the argument, what we're saying is that so long as there exists some relation between the sound of the tree falling and somebody with the ability to hear it, then we are presuming that the sound exists. In all of our examples, therefore, whenever we evoke the hypothetical of the tree that falls, in effect what we're saying is that the sound always exists. So perhaps in order to answer the question of, if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, we first need to imagine what it would mean for there to truly be no one around to hear it. In order to once and for all put an end to this increasingly stubborn question of the tree that falls, we need to begin envisioning a completely different world, one in which there exists absolutely no relation between the sound of the tree falling and an observer with the ability to hear it. For that, we must imagine a scenario where unequivocally no information can travel between the tree and any potential listeners. We must start thinking of a parallel universe, a universe without ears, entirely distinct and separate from our own. Let's imagine a world, a parallel universe, in which life never developed the ability to hear sound. In this world, there are no ears. Not a single being has ever been able to extrapolate meaning from the vibration of a physical medium. Hypothetically, the vibrations are still there, Trees still fall to the ground and compress the air around them. It's just that this has no effect on the observers of that world. The living beings in this universe never have nor never will experience the qualia of sound. Of course, were we to be put in this world, then all of a sudden we would start hearing all of the vibrations that those earless entities could not. But as we have suggested already, this world is entirely shut off from our own. Not a single bit of information can travel between their world and ours. These are parallel universes, entirely distinct and isolated from one another. So, can we still say of this place that it is a world in which sound exists? And to this I would say, no. A sound that cannot be perceived is a sound that does not exist. In our world, we can accept that if a tree falls with no one around to hear it, the tree still makes a sound, because had there been somebody around, the sound would have been heard. But in a world in which sound can never be heard, there exists no relationship between vibrating molecules and the observers of that world, and thus the observers of that world would have never come up with a definition of sound. The concept of sound itself would have no meaning. It would have remained undefined. It seems absurd to think that this is a world in which sound can exist. This would sort of be like if we were asked to believe in a magical ether that permeated all of reality. This ether does not interact with anything in our world. It cannot be measured, perceived, or observed. It has no effect whatsoever on any physical thing, nor on the contents of our minds. So then why should we accept that this ether exists, if it has no verifiable claim to being a part of our reality? If we begin accepting that things that have absolutely no effect on our reality exist, then we run into the risk of having to accept any number of possible ethers. And so how do we then make sense of which of these ethers exist and which do not, when there is a seemingly infinite number of potential ethers that we can never even hope to observe? Things are real insofar as they have an effect on the real world. A thing that has no effect whatsoever on physical reality can have no assertion to being a part of said reality. In a world without ears, in a world in which there exists no relationship between the noumenal sounds and the observers of that world, it seems meaningless to presume that this is a world in which sound exists. In fact, I would even go a step further and say that the world itself, this parallel universe, is a place that cannot exist. But for that, we're going to need a separate video, so if you're curious and you want to find out more, stick around for the following episode on why parallel universes do not exist. The thought experiment of the tree that falls is often attributed to the philosophy of George Berkeley. Berkeley himself was an immaterialist who held that ordinary objects were only collections of ideas which are mind-dependent, and that the world itself was made up of no material substances. Basically, what Berkeley believed was that material things did not exist, and that objects existed only in relation to our perception of them.
The objects of sense exist only when they are perceived. The trees, therefore, in the garden no longer than while there is somebody by to perceive them.
To be is to be perceived is the central claim of Berkeley's philosophy. For him, a sound that is not heard simply does not exist. This philosophy is also referred to as subjective idealism, and admittedly when I first came across it, I used to just think that this was Berkeley being a little too fond of the old water pipe. But the more I learn about physics, information theory, and especially things like quantum entanglement, the more inclined I am to believe it. In quantum physics, for example, at least according to the Copenhagen interpretation, an event is real only insofar as it is an observed event. Until the observation is made, an event exists only in terms of a probability distribution. The event exists only in relation to the observation. All things that exist in relation to one another. And one undeniable aspect of existence is our own subjective experience of reality. This is just an extrapolation of Descartes' "I think therefore I am," that the one thing in this world that we can never truly be sure to exist is our own conscious experience of it. All things that exist, therefore, must exist in relation to this subjective experience. And from here we can conclude that no material object exists independently of subjective experience. To sum it up in words, the more you think about it, the less plausible it seems to imagine a world without conscious beings such as ourselves. We can imagine a tree falling without somebody around to hear it, but we can't imagine that tree falling without somebody first imagining it. Our world does in fact seem to be a participatory universe, where the observer themselves plays a critical role in the underlying ontology. This is a very brief introduction to something that we shall be exploring in a lot more depth in the following video, so I'll just have to leave it at that for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious.
Tree, if one of you falls and there's no one around, do you make a noise?
Are you kidding? Scott fell last week. He hasn't shut up about it since.
Sure, stand there and bitch, but would any of you take the time to help me?
Ooh, I'm playing the world's smallest violin, Scott.